Hi, this is Magda from wnetrzazewnetrza. In this episode, I'll answer some of your kitchen questions. Is it possible to place a spice drawer between the induction cooktop and the oven? Because of that, it was hard to find the right place for cutlery. After all, there isn't a cabinet with drawers here, and that's why the oven was installed unusually lower. And the drawer, which is usually under the oven, this time is on top, and it's a cutlery drawer. In interiors, almost anything is possible, but the question is it worth it? And in the case of a drawer under the cooktop, that's a very good question, because on one hand, it's actually very convenient, we have good access to it. And after all, drawers under cooktops are often used when the oven is in a tall cabinet. However, I've already heard several times that such a drawer does get a bit warm. It doesn't get super hot, but modern household appliances don't heat up that much. But it does get a little warm, and there's also the question of how this affects spices. I'm not an expert on spices, you'll have to ask someone else about that, but it's definitely something worth considering. It's also important to consider the kitchen design itself. Keep in mind that there are kitchen cabinets available in heights of 80 centimeters and over 90 centimeters. And here we have quite a big difference actually. The plinths can also be higher or lower, and if we're making a custom kitchen, its height can be even more non-standard. Ovens also come in higher and lower versions, and depending on what we choose, the distance between a low-placed oven and the cooktop can vary. Sometimes under an oven that's mounted high, there's usually a drawer at the bottom, and sometimes there are two drawers. So if two drawers can fit, you can just as well imagine that you could have a drawer at the top plus some kind of spacer panel, a spacer separating the drawers from the appliances. It's hard to say how the carpenter will ultimately decide to do it, or whether every carpenter would be willing to take it on. Definitely not. So that's a very individual matter. However, it's often the case that people who make furniture advise against various non-standard solutions, but sometimes, convinced by the client, they decide to try to make them. And then it turns out that it's cool, and the company adds it to their offer and is more willing to do it in the future. So it's also a bit about being open to new things. Are dividers for plates in the drawer better, or is a non-slip mat enough? Once again, the answer depends. In the case of a large drawer and small plates, I would definitely go for dividers myself. There are even very simple racks with just vertical posts that keep a stack of plates from toppling over when you open the drawer energetically. If in a given drawer we just have two stacks of very large heavy plates like Bolesławiec ones, then they don't really move around much. However, when it comes to small dessert plates, more like saucers, then the movement can be much greater. If there was a tall, narrow stack, it could definitely tip over, so it's better to secure it additionally. However, in the case of these large plates, the mat should also be sufficient. I want to put drawers in all the lower cabinets. I know that's your favorite type of storage, right? What drawers do you recommend for long-lasting use? Bloomy. Right, that's an interesting topic too, because I actually feel like Blom has monopolized the market. When it comes to rails and hinges for kitchen cabinets, the quality of their products is actually very good. I've often recommended the IKEA system method modular kitchen on my channel, because keep in mind that IKEA has different kitchens, and the system method also uses Blom hinges. And they are, well, good, I have to admit, so it's definitely a safe choice that I think is worth going for. However, I've also come across other systems, but to be honest, I didn't even remember the names, although I did show them to you. And that's also a kitchen that appears in the album. In a studio apartment like that, where part of the kitchen was built under the stairs, there's a pull-out countertop that turns into a table. And for me, it was surprising how well it works. Because that it works in general, that's obvious, but the fact that the table is actually stable, you can lean on it while sitting and nothing happens, that was really impressive. Well, that was impressive to me because, different solutions are used, but how they actually work in practice can really vary. However, this one worked really well. And then I asked Carolina, the owner, what kind of rail it was. I can link it for you in the description. I'll probably find the contact for it. However, it wasn't Bloom, so as you can see, other companies also make good rails. The only question is, how much do you feel like experimenting? Bloom is definitely a standard of good quality. However, what I would like to point out is that even within Bloom rails, we have some choices. And sometimes we look at the kitchen in an IKEA store. We know that there are Bloom rails there. The drawer pulls out completely. The carpenter says he'll make it with Bloom rails, and we think it will be the same. But then the carpenter uses a different Bloom rail, and the drawer doesn't pull out all the way. So it's worth paying attention to these kinds of details because not all rails are the same. What cutlery organizers do you recommend, and how do you think the ones from IKEA work? Visually, my favorite cutlery organizers are the wooden ones, also found at IKEA. They're then matched to the drawers that IKEA sells, so it really works well. However, when it comes to organizing within that organizer, I'm not really a fan because there are very long compartments for cutlery, knives, spoons, and forks, which means that the compartment for teaspoons is just really far away. So on one hand, we can arrange it so that the teaspoons are closest to us. But still, I reach for a knife or fork more often, I think, than for a teaspoon. And then I have to open the drawer more to reach for all the other 3 types of cutlery. So I prefer to have knives, forks, and spoons closer, and teaspoons just a little farther away. Then I can usually open the drawer less and only reach deeper for the teaspoons, but then I really have to open it very wide because the teaspoons are far away. So if I could, I would make an organizer in this style, but with slightly different dimensions, more suited to my cutlery. And of course you can make custom organizers, but it's not as simple as just going to the store and buying ready-made ones. What's the best lighting for above the countertops? I know that once again, I can't give you one obvious answer off the top of my head, because when it comes to interiors, there's no such thing as the best or the worst. It's all about personal preference. And I pay attention to the color of the lighting and definitely also to making sure the countertop is evenly illuminated. So we avoid having small, widely spaced spots that create alternating light and shadow. Well, that's not really good. However, now there are a lot of those light panels that really nicely and evenly illuminate the countertop. However, I pay attention to the color. I don't like it when the kitchen is lit with neutral, warm light, but the countertop is cold, kind of white. I just don't like mixing different lighting colors. I prefer when all the lamps have similar colors, and then everything matches nicely for me. And when I was designing a black kitchen, it was really pleasant in that regard. Even the coffee machine had a nice matching lighting color. I bought the entire kitchen and all the lamps at IKEA, so matching everything here was easy. However, the LED strip that was in another part of the room, more like the living area, well, it was bought a bit too quickly and it turned out to have a different color, which was a huge tragedy for me. And I planned to replace it, but in the end I just didn't have time. As for the remote, I'm definitely not a fan of remotes myself because it's just so easy to put the remote down somewhere and then you have no idea where it is. It's like with scissors. I use them often and they're usually in the drawer, so I always have to put them back in that drawer. But sometimes I do something quickly and leave them somewhere along the way and then I don't know where they are. I walk around searching for them just like with the remote, or we always put it in the same place. For example, we stick it to the fridge, so it's always in the same spot anyway. So it's just like a regular switch on the wall, but if we walk around with the remote, it's easy to misplace it somewhere and then it's a problem to turn off the light. That's why when I was making a black kitchen myself, I just installed regular switches. In the wall, there was a remote control for those lights, but everything was also connected to the switches, and the remote was hidden in a cabinet. I didn't use it at all. I did it in such a way that those lights were plugged into the socket just like always, and then you just turn them on with the remote as usual. However, here the socket was connected to the switch and you used the switch to turn it on. This socket was either powered on or cut off from electricity, and the lights were as if they were always turned on with the remote, but you could cut off the power with the switch on the wall. And I definitely preferred this solution, so as you can see, there's no such thing as right or wrong here. Some people prefer the remote, others prefer standard solutions, and I happen to be in the latter group. Which is the best kick-to-open bin system? I won't comment specifically on kick-to-open systems, as I think it ultimately depends on something else. Maybe not everything. Honestly, if something is bad, it's just bad. But the same system sometimes works better and sometimes worse, depending on how it's installed. So from my perspective, the key thing here is the installation itself, more than the system. If you have any more interior design dilemmas, feel free to write your questions in the comments or by email, and maybe there will be another episode with answers. This could be a nice format. And by the way, if you have your own experiences, observations, impressions, or preferences related to the topics I discussed, please share them too, because it's great to bring together different perspectives. It definitely sheds much more light, because together we all have infinitely more experiences than I do alone, and after all, it's on experiences that we build our knowledge. Finally, I invite you to visit wnetrzazewnetrzaofficial, where you'll find interior design books full of tips and inspiration. So if you're just decorating your place, be sure to check out our offer. I especially recommend, of course, our album Polish Interiors, which you can buy in the standard version or with a personalized dedication as a gift. However, it's also available in an outlet version, because some copies aren't as perfect as I would expect from the album. And then you can buy it at a slightly lower price, and now for a week with the code WAKAJKI, you get an extra 15% off everything, so I especially invite you and see you next time. Bye!